The photographic representation of a structure can sometimes be imperfect because the process in which we record images is not a perfect process. Chromatic aberration and lens distortions are two imperfections that we will consider in this tutorial. Chromatic aberration is a visual imperfection caused by the lens. This is usually noticeable in the area of a photograph that has a defined, high contrast edge, and it could be described as a colored halo that runs along that edge. In addition to correcting for chromatic aberration, there are several types of lens distortion that we will correct for in this tutorial. They are pincushion distortion, barrel distortion, and keystone distortion. Pincushion distortion appears to pull the outer edges of the image inward, while barrel distortion is the opposite of pincushion distortion and appears to balloon or bulge the edges of the image outward. Keystone distortion is caused by the camera being tilted upward towards a building or structure and causes the top portion to appear narrower than the bottom. With a large format camera, the photographer could correct for this type of distortion in camera prior to shooting, but the same correction can be applied in post-production. There are several ways to correct for distortion and chromatic aberration in Photoshop. You can also correct for distortion in other software programs like Adobe Lightroom in a very similar way that we are here. In Photoshop, I'm going to open an image in Camera Raw. The first thing that we will remove is the chromatic aberration. Notice that when I zoom into the image, you can see the colored edges that are characteristic of chromatic aberration. To remove this, click on the Lens Correction tab, then Profile. At the bottom you will see a box to check titled Remove Chromatic Aberration. Notice that when this is selected, the colored haloing is removed. You can also do this manually, and we're going to cover that in a moment. The next thing we're going to do is correct this image for distortion in Camera Raw. Notice that when I select Enable Lens Profile Corrections, RAW corrects for some of the distortion with any given lens that you might use. The lens information is listed here below. This information is captured in the image's data when shooting in RAW. I can then click on Manual and further adjust the distortion as well as straighten the image. It might help to position a grid over the image so you can assure that the image is straight. To do this, select the menu to the right of the Lens Correction tab and choose to View Grid. Now adjust the image. When you're making adjustments, try to do small increments until the edge of your structure is straight and distortion free by comparing it to the straight edge of the grid. You may find you use all of the adjustments or just a few of them. You will notice that this photograph does not need a great deal of adjustment. If you are careful when shooting, you can correct for some distortion beforehand by having the camera straight, which in my opinion is always a good idea. Once your image is corrected, you can either zoom in until the edges of the frame that have now been distorted in order to correct the image are out of the frame, or you can zoom out and crop those out later. Either works fine. Now let's correct for distortion outside of Camera Raw. First, open the raw image and make any exposure adjustments needed. Then press Open Image. Now choose Filter from the top menu and then Lens Correction. Notice how many of the adjustments are the same or very similar to Camera Raw. You can allow Photoshop to make many of the adjustments for you based on the lens you worked with, or you can do a custom adjustment. For this tutorial, I'm going to do a custom adjustment. Select the Custom tab. The first thing I will do is remove the barrel distortion that is evident in this photograph. Make sure to select Show Grid so we can assure everything is straight. With the geometric distortion slider, take out the barrel distortion. Notice if I go too far the other direction, I start to get that pincushion distortion I discussed earlier. Choose a setting that gives you a nice straight edge. Just below that, notice that I can now remove chromatic aberration. Just like in Camera Raw, I can now adjust for that colored edge caused by the chromatic aberration, but I have a few more options here. The next setting is vignette. Some lenses tend to give you more vignetting around the corners of your photograph, which can be removed here if need be. The last thing I will do is continue to adjust the image, removing keystone distortion and just straightening the image in general. This can be done with a combination of vertical and horizontal adjustments, as well as some angle adjustments. Once your image is straight, you can either scale the image so the adjustments cannot be seen, or open the image and crop them out. Now that I have removed all the distortion, I can further adjust my images or crop and save the finished file. The last thing to consider when removing distortion is, depending on how much distortion you need to remove, you should plan for the loss of image information on all sides of the image due to correction. This should be pre-visualized and allowed for when shooting. Notice that in this example, because the structure is tall, I have a great deal of distortion to remove. When I begin to make my adjustments, I'm almost running out of room on the lower sides of the image that I will crop out later. A bit more care should have been taken to allow for this loss of space. Once I correct for the distortion, I crop and then save the finished image.